master the authentication in a full stack project with Next.js, Next-Auth in the front end, and Nest.js in the back end. In the backend section, we are going to use Nest.js, and you will learn how to create a login API, create your access token and refresh token, how to protect your APIs with JWT access tokens, and how to create a refresh token API. We're not going to use any third-party packages like Passport.js. We're going to implement these functionalities from scratch so you can learn them in a very basic level and therefore understand how authentication works in backend side. In the front end, we use Next.js version 13 and Next-Auth, and you will learn how to integrate the Next-Auth with your Next.js project, how to retrieve the Next-Auth session in the client components as well as the server components, how to save the backend access tokens in the Next-Auth session, and how to protect your pages with Next-Auth middleware, and how to use Next-Auth callbacks. And most importantly, you will learn how to implement a robust solution for refreshing the backend access tokens automatically with Next-Auth in your client and also your server components. So sit tight here because you will learn a lot about the authentication in this tutorial. And let's get right into it. Okay, so now let's create our Nest.js project. In order to do that, we need to install the Nest CLI, and we can install it with npm i-g at nestjs/cli. And since I have it on my machine, I'm not going to install it again. Okay, so now we can create our project with the Nest, new, and then name of our project, which is going to be auth-nest. I'm going to go ahead with the npm here, and we're going to wait for installation. Okay, so now let's open up the project. Okay, the first step that we should do here is to configure Prisma. Actually, I wanted to use Drizzle RM, but it requires more SQL knowledge and is more complex than Prisma. So I decided to use Prisma for this project because it's simpler and it allows us to focus on authentication part of this project. But if you are a Drizzle RM fan, don't worry. After this video, I will upload a very short video and refactor this project to use Drizzle RM. So now let's install the Prisma. Okay, I open up the terminal and I'm going to say npm install prisma --save dev. Okay, and now we can use npx prisma init to initialize our Prisma setup. So as you can see here, we have a Prisma directory, and inside it we have the Prisma schema, and also it will create for us a .env file, and inside it creates a database URL for us. And since we're going to use SQLite for this project, we're going to change it to the file :/dev.db. So it will create a dev.db file in the root path of our application. So let's save this, and now we can go back to our schema.prisma file, and here change the provider to SQLite. Okay, and you can see here we are reading the database URL from a env function which reads the database URL variable from the env file. And since we are going to use env variables, we should install the config module with Nest.js. Otherwise, we can't use env variables. So in order to do that, I'm going to install the Nest.js/config package, and then we should go to our root module, the app module.ts file, and here inside the imports list, I'm going to use the config module and call the for-root function here. Okay, so now we can access to the env variable throughout our Nest.js project. So let's get back to our schema file, and here I'm going to create a model for user. So I just paste the user model. It has an ID, email, name, and password. If you're not familiar with Prisma, I have a comprehensive course on Prisma, and you can watch it and master the Prisma. Okay, cool. Now we can use the migrations to actually create the user table inside our database. So I'm going to say npx prisma migrate dev and set a name for it. I'm going to go ahead with the init, and we have a problem here, and that's because we didn't save our schema. So let's save this and run the prisma migrate command again. And now as you can see, we have a dev.db file inside our Prisma. So the user table is now created in our SQLite database. The next step is to create a Prisma service so we can use it inside other module to do CRUD operation with Prisma. So in order to do that, we need to install the Prisma client. So here I'm going to install the Prisma client with this command, npm install at prisma/client. Okay, and then we can create the Prisma service. So inside our root module, the app module, I'm going to create a prisma.service file. So I'm going to say prisma user.service.ts. Okay, and then inside it, we're going to copy and paste the code from the Nest.js documentation. It will create a Prisma service that extend the Prisma client, and on the module in it, actually it will call the connect function from the Prisma. So here you can see it's a injectable class, and later we can inject and use this service in other services. So let's save this. And now we're done with configuring the Prisma with our application. That's simple. So we can go ahead to the next section of this tutorial, and that is creating the user module. Okay, so let's create the user module. I'm going to say Nest GMO, which stands for module, and then the name of our module, which is user. So as you can see here, it creates a user module for us. And here we need to create a user service and also a user controller. So here I'm going to say Nest GS user, which creates the user service for us. And then we're going to create the controller with Nest GCO, again, user. Okay, so now let's get rid of the test file inside the user module. And as you can see, we have a user controller, user module, and also a user service. Okay, and here we're going to go to the user service and create a function for creating a new user. And later we can use this function inside our auth service for registering a new user. So here, first of all, we need to inject the Prisma service here. So inside the constructor of this service, we're going to use the Prisma service. So I'm going to say private Prisma, which is going to be type of Prisma service. Okay, and now we can create the create function in this service. So here I'm going to create an async function, create, which takes an object that contains the name, email, and password of the new user for registering that user inside our database. Usually we use DTOs for this purpose. So inside the user directory, I'm going to create a directory called DTO, and inside it we're going to create a file called user.dto.ts. Okay, and here we can create our create user DTO. But before doing that, we need to install two packages here, the map types and class validator. So here in the terminal, I'm going to say npm I at nestjs/map types. And then we need to install the class validator, and I think we need to install the class transformer here. Okay, so we have installed these three packages, and now we can use them in our DTO files. So here I'm going to export a class called create user DTO, and to speed up the process, I just paste the body of this create user DTO here, and here we should import these decorators from the class validator package, and let's import is email decorator as well. Okay, as you can see, our DTO object should have a name, email, and also a password inside it. So with this DTO, we can easily validate our input data, which come through the body of a HTTP request. So let's save this DTO and go to the user service. And before doing that, if you're feeling that these are kind of too abstract for you, again, I highly recommend you to watch my crash course for Nest.js. I'm not going to teach you about the detail of the Nest.js framework. We just want to focus on authentication part. So as you can see, we are doing these configurations real quick. So let's get back to our create function here, and now we can use the create user DTO. So here we have a DTO as the parameter of the create function, which its type is the create user DTO. Okay, and first we should check inside our database if the user is already in our user table or not. So we're going to say const user and set it to await this.prisma.user.find unique, and inside the option object we're going to specify the where API. Okay, and here we're going to specify email and set it to DTO.email. So this will check if the email of the user is already in our user table or not. And then we can check if the user is existed. We can throw an exception here. I'm going to say throw new conflict exception. Okay, and then pass the custom message inside it. We're going to say email duplicated, and then we can create our new user. So I'm going to say const new user, set it to await this.prisma.user.create, and then pass the option object and specify the data here. And here we can spread the DTO here. It contains the name, email, and the password of the new user. But here we should hash the password of the user before inserting the user in our database. We need to install the Bcrypt package here. So I'm going to say npm I bcrypt. Okay, and then we need to install the types of the bcrypt. So I'm going to say npm i-d add types / bcrypt. Okay, so now here we can import the hash function from the bcrypt module. So here I'm going to say import from bcrypt, and then we can grab the hash function here. Okay, and here we can set the password to hashed version of the password. So I'm going to say await hash function. Again, this hash function comes from the bcrypt module, and then put the dto.password and then pass the number of salt rounds. So I'm going to put the default value, which is 10, and the number of salt rounds determine the computational complexity of the hash algorithm and actually affects the time it takes to calculate the hash. The number of 10 is the default value for the hash function inside the bcrypt module. So we just go ahead with the 10. Okay, and then here we can return the new user to the client. So we can just return the new user, but before doing that, we can extract the password from the user object and then pass the user with that password. So here I'm going to say const an object and set it to new user. Okay, and we just extract the password and put the rest into the result object. Okay, so the result object is just ID, email, and name of the user. And now we can return the result. Okay, and now we can move to the heart of our project, which is the auth module. So here I'm going to create a module called auth nestgmo auth and create a controller for it, nestgco auth, and also we need to create a service for this module. Okay, and let's close this off, and here as you can see we have the auth module here. So let's get rid of the test file inside this module. We have a controller, a module, and also a service inside our auth module. Okay, so we're going to go to the auth controller, and here the first thing we should do here is to create the register endpoint, which is for registering or signing up a new user. So it's going to be a post request. So I use the post decorator here, and let's name it register. We can also name it sign up, but I think register is better for that. Okay, and let's import the post from the nestjs/common package, and then we're going to create our function, which is a async create register user. And here we can access to the body of the request with the body decorator. Okay, and here we can turn the body to a create user DTO. So for doing that, make sure that you have installed the class transformer. Okay, so I'm going to say DTO and set it to create user DTO. And then inside it, we can call the user service.create function. So in order to do that, we need to inject the user service into the auth controller. So inside the constructor, I'm going to say private user service, which is going to be type of user service class. Okay, and here we can use the user service here. So let's fix the typo here. Okay, so here inside the register user function, we're going to say return await this the user service create function and pass the create user DTO to the create function, and that's it. It will create a new user inside our database. Okay, so now let's run our server and test this register function. So I'm going to say npm run start :dev. Okay, it gives us an error, and that's because we are using the user service inside the auth module, but user service does not belong to auth module. So we're going to go to the auth module here, and here in the providers list, we're going to add the user service here. Okay, and that should solve the problem, but we have another error here. And also we should go to the user module and add the Prisma service here because we are using the Prisma service inside our user module. Okay, again we have another error, and also we should add the Prisma service in the auth module. And also we need to register the Prisma service in the app.module here. So here we're going to add the Prisma service in the providers list of the app module. Okay, and we got another error, and that's because we didn't save the auth module here. Okay, so if you are using a service inside a module, we should add it in the providers list of that module. So as you can see, our application is running without any error. Okay, and now we can use the Insomnia client to test our register API. But before doing that, let's go to the main.ts file and change the port of the application to 8000, because later we are going to use Next.js, and Next.js, as you know, use the port 3000 as its default port. So we're going to change the port of the Next.js project to 8000. Okay, so now we can go to the Insomnia client, and here, as you can see, we are going to send a post request to the localhost 8000/auth/register. So we're going to send that, and as you can see, it will create for us a user that has the ID of 1, and it returns the email of the user and the name of the user. Okay, so now let's go to the Prisma Studio to see if the user is really in our database or not. So I'm going to say npx Prisma Studio. Okay, we have the user model here, and as you can see, we have the user here, sakura@gmail.com, and as you can see, the password is hashed in our database. Let's go back to our Insomnia. You can see we passed the password of the user as 123, but here you can see the password is converted to a hashed version. So yeah, that's it for the register section of the auth module, and now we can go ahead and create the login API for our auth module. Okay, so I go to the auth controller here, and here we're going to create our login API, and this is where our authentication process actually starts. And for authentication purposes inside our Next.js application, we can use the Passport library. The Passport library, which is a great and convenient way of authentication in Next.js. But here we're not going to use Passport library because it's too abstract and you can't actually learn and understand what's going on in our auth module. We're going to implement the auth module and authentication process from scratch so you can understand what's going on deep inside our auth module. And actually, I have a tutorial for using the Passport library for authentication in Next.js, and you can watch it if you want. But I highly recommend you to watch this section till the end if you want to master and understand deeply how authentication works in Next.js and in general in Node.js applications. Okay, so let's get into it. The first step we should take here is to create a login API. So we're going to create another post endpoint for our login, which is our login endpoint. So I'm going to use the post decorator here, and let's name it login. Okay, and now we can create our function. I'm going to go ahead and create the login function, which is going to be an async function. And here our client must send the username and password inside the body of this post request. So we can access to the body of the post request with the body decorator, and we can turn it to a DTO here. So let's create a login DTO for our login API. So inside our auth module, I'm going to create a directory called DTO, and inside it, we're going to create a file called auth.dto.ts, and inside it we're going to export the login DTO class, which expect a username, which is an email, and a password, which is going to be a string. So let's import the isString and isEmail from the class validator, and we're good to go. So we can use this login DTO in our login API. So let's get back to our auth controller, and here we can define the DTO, which is going to be login DTO class that we've just created. And here we should call a login function from our auth service, but we haven't created this function yet. So now we're going to create it. So let's go to the auth service here and create our login function. So I'm going to create an async function login, which takes a DTO, which is going to be type of login DTO class. Okay, and here first we need to validate the user. So for validation, I'm going to create another function in this class. I'm going to create a function called validate user. It takes the DTO again, which is going to be login DTO. And here first we need to check inside our database if a user with the provided user that is inside our DTO is inside our user table or not. So first we need to go to the user service and create a function for retrieving the user based on the username from our user table. So I go to the user service and here create a function called find by email, and it is going to take an email as its parameter, which is going to be a string, and then we can use the Prisma service for finding the user. So I'm going to say return await this dot prisma dot user dot find unique, okay, and then pass the option object and specify the where object inside it, and then we can specify the email here and set it to the email parameter that we've got here, okay. And now we can go to the auth service again and here use the find by email from the user service. So first we need to inject the user service inside our auth service. So inside the constructor we're going to say private user service, which is going to be type of user service, okay. And now we can use it inside our validate user. So let's close this off to have more space here, and here I'm going to say const user equals to await this the user service dot find by email, and then pass the DTO dot username. So we are using the email as the username of the user, okay. And then we can check if the user is existed, if user, and then we can check the password of the user. So we're going to do it with the compare function of the bcrypt package. So let's import the compare function from bcrypt module. So I'm going to say import from bcrypt, and then we can grab the compare function from it, okay. And here we can use a parenthesis here, and inside it we're going to await compare, and then first we need to pass the provided password, which is coming from our login API. So I'm going to use the DTO.password and then pass the hashed version of the user password, which we can get from the user object here. I'm going to pass the user.password. So again, remember that we've got this user object from the find by email from the user service. It is the user that we've got from the user table. So the compare function first hash the DTO.password and then compare the hashed version of the DTO.password with the user.password, which is already hashed inside our database. So if this condition is true, it means that the username and password are correct. So we can return the user from the validate user function, which means that the credentials here inside the DTO object are correct and valid. So we just return the user, but for more safety we can extract the password from the user object. So we can grab the password out of the user object and then return the result. So the result object is actually the user object without the password. Okay, and if this condition here is not correct, which means that username and password are not correct, we should throw an unauthorized exception here. So here we can throw a new unauthorized exception here. Okay, it actually returns a 401 error message to the client. We can also pass custom message inside it. For example, we can say username or password are not correct. Okay, so now we can go back to our login function here and use this validate user inside that function. Okay, so here we can say const user and set it to await this dot validate user and pass the DTO inside it. Okay, so if the credentials are correct and we've got the user here, we should return the user object with a JWT access token and also a JWT refresh token to the client. So we need to create two JWTs here, the access token and refresh token from the user object. So in order to create the JWTs, we need to install a package called nestjs/JWT. So I open up my terminal again, and here I'm going to say npm I at nestjs/JWT. Okay, and now we can use the JWT service from the JWT module of the Nest.js. So we're going to inject it in this service. So here inside the constructor, I'm going to say private JWT service and set it to JWT service that comes from the Nest.js/JWT. And since we are using the JWT service, we should register it in the auth module. So inside the auth module, here I'm going to add it to the providers of the auth module. Okay, and we're good to go. So I go back to our auth service again, and here inside the login function, first we need to create a payload. So I'm going to say const payload, which is going to be an object, and it has the username inside it, which is going to be user.email. Okay, and it has the sub object, which is going to have a name inside it, which is the name of the user. So I'm going to set it to user.name. Okay, so we are going to create our JWTs from this payload object. So here we're going to return an object here which has the user inside it, and also it has a backend tokens object which has the access token inside it. And now we can create a JWT with JWT service and set it to this access token. So I'm going to say await this JWT service sign async, and then pass the payload object inside it. And then we need to pass an option object. First we need to set the expiry time of this JWT. We're going to set the expires in and set it to 1h, which stands for 1 hour. And then we should specify a secret key for creating the JWT. Okay, so I'm going to go to the .env file and create a JWT secret key. And now we can set it to a random and complex secret key. You can set it to a random string here, but the better way is to create a complex secret key with OpenSSL command. So if you are on Linux machine, you can open up your terminal and paste this command, OpenSSL rand and then base 64, and you can create a random and complex secret key with this command. So as you can see, it will create a really complex secret key. So I copy that and put it in front of the JWT secret key. Okay, and then we can have another key here for creating the refresh token. So I'm going to call it JWT refresh token. We can use the same secret key for creating the refresh token, but it is recommended to have different key for refresh token. So again, let's call the OpenSSL command again, and let's copy that and paste it in front of the JWT refresh token. And for the type safety and auto completion for our env variables, we can create a type file for our env variable. So here I'm going to create a file in the root path of our application. I'm going to call it module.d.ts. I'm going to declare a namespace Node.js and then export an interface for process env. Just pay attention to the spellings here, and then it should have the database URL inside it, which is going to be string, and also a JWT secret, which is going to be string, and then a JWT refresh token, which is going to be string as well. So let's save this and close this off, and let's close the env file as well. And here inside our login function, we can set the secret here to the process.env.jwt secret key. Okay, and here in order to be able to access to the env variable, you should have installed the Next.js config module, and here configure the config module here in the app.module.ts file, as you remember in the first step of this tutorial. So let's close this off and get back to our login API. And here, as you can see, the backend tokens contains an access token, which is a JWT that is created from the payload that we've created here. And here we pass the secret to the process.env JWT secret key that we have just created with the OpenSSL command. Okay, and then the backend token is going to have a refresh token. So let's copy this and let's change it to the refresh token, and let's set the expires into 7 days, and let's set the secret to the JWT refresh token. Actually, let's rename it to the refresh token key in order to avoid confusion here. So I go to the env file and add a key to the JWT refresh token, and let's copy that and go to our module.d.ts file and change it to the JWT refresh token key. So now let's save it here and get back to our auth service, and let's set it to JWT refresh token key. Okay, so here as you can see, if the credentials of the user is correct, we return the user object, and then we create a backend tokens object which contains JWT access token and also a JWT refresh token. So let's get back to our auth controller, and here inside the login API, we just return the login function from our auth service. This auth service. We didn't inject it in our auth controller, so let's quickly do that. And here we're going to say private auth service and set its type to the auth service class. Okay, now we can use it here. So I'm going to say this.auth service and call the login function and pass the DTO inside it. So yeah, that's it for the login function. Now we can test it inside the Insomnia. So I go to Insomnia, and here I've already created the login API, which send a post request to the localhost 8000/auth/login. Here, as you can see, we have the username and the password in the body of this post request. So let's send the request to our server. And as you can see, we have a user object which has the ID, email, and name inside it. And also we have the backend tokens, which contains an access token and refresh token. Later in this video, in the Next.js section of the video, you can see that we save these access tokens inside the next auth session, and then we can use them whenever we want to access to a protected API in our Next.js server. Okay, so now let's pass a wrong password here. Okay, and then send the request, and you can see here we have the unauthorized error. So as you can see, our login API works correctly. Okay, in this section, we're going to protect our APIs with JWT access token. So as a first step, I'm going to create an endpoint inside our user controller, and then we're going to protect it with the JWT access token. So here I'm going to create a get endpoint here. So I use the get decorator. Okay, so let's import it from the Next.js/common, and this API will return the user profile. So we need to get the ID of the user as a params in this get endpoint. So I'm going to put a colon here and then pass the ID here. Okay, and then I'm going to create an async function here. I'm going to call it get user profile, and it is going to access to the params decorator here and then pass the ID here because we name our params to ID here. And now we can have access to the ID params here. So I'm going to name it ID here and set its type to number. Okay, and here we can return a function from the user service which returns the user object based on the provided ID. So let's quickly create this function. I go to the user service and just copy the find by email function. Okay, and let's rename it to the find by ID, and here we should have the ID which is going to be a number, and in the where object we can specify the ID and set it to ID parameter here. Okay, so that's it with the find by ID, and now we can get back to the user controller and use that function. So here I'm going to say return await this the user service. So we didn't inject it in the user controller, so inside the constructor we can inject it. So I'm going to say private user service and set its type to user service class. Okay, and now we can use it here. So I'm going to say this dot user service dot find by ID and then pass the ID here. Okay, and now we can go to the Insomnia, and here as you can see I have created a user profile which send the request to the /user/1, and this one will be our ID param. So if I send the request, you can see we have a internal error. So let's get back to our Nest.js here and see what's going on here. And here the Prisma is expecting a number, but the ID params is a string. So the type of the params that comes from our HTTP endpoints are always string. So we need to convert them to number if we want them as number. So we can manually do that, or we can do it with the Nest.js pipeline. So I go to the main.ts file, and here I'm going to say app.useGlobalPipes and then pass a new validation pipe. Okay, and then we're going to pass the option inside it. We're going to set the whitelist to true, forbid non-whitelisted to true as well. So for example, if our DTO object must contains username and password, if we pass an extra property in the body of our request, it will actually block that request and send a proper message to the client that says the extra property should not be included in the body object. And then we can set the transform to true. So by setting the transform to true, it will automatically turn the ID, which is a string, to the number here. So if I get back to Insomnia and send the request, you can see that it will return the user object to the client. So we are going to protect this API from unauthenticated user. So how we can do that? As you have seen earlier in this project, when a user login into our Nest.js application, we create a JWT access token and send it back to the client. And our client, which is a Next.js application, should keep that access token inside the next auth session. And whenever the client wants to access to the protected API, it should include that access token in the header of its request. So here in our protected API, we should check if a valid access token is inside the header of the request. So in order to do that, we're going to create a guard for our application, and whenever we want to protect an API, we can decorate our API with that guard, and it will automatically check for JWT access token in the header of the request. So let's get right into it. So I go back to our Nest.js application, and here inside the auth module, I'm going to create a directory called guards, and inside it, we're going to create a file called jwt.guard.ts. If we are going to use the passport library for our authentication, this JWT guard can be easily created with the JWT strategy that is coming from the passport library. But as I said, we don't want to use passport library because it's too abstract, and we're going to create this JWT guard from scratch without any specific library. And then I'm going to show you how we can use this guard to protect our API. Okay, so as a first step, we need to export a class named JWT guard. So I'm going to say export class JWT guard, and that class implements the CanActivate interface, which is come from the Next.js/common. And then this class should have a CanActivate function. So I'm going to say async CanActivate, which, as you can see here, since we implement the CanActivate interface, it will automatically create the function for us. So this class is kind of like a middleware that sits before our API endpoint. And in this CanActivate function, we're going to decide if we are going to allow the request to go ahead and reach our API. So actually in this function, we're going to extract the JWT access token from the header of the incoming request and check that JWT. And if that's a valid JWT, we're going to return true from this function, which means that the Nest.js allows the request to reach our protected API. And if the JWT is not in the request header, or it is not a valid JWT, we just return false. Therefore, Nest.js will block the incoming request. So it will protect our API. So let's define the body of the CanActivate function. So first we need to access to the request object. So I'm going to say const request and set it to context, which is from the parameter of the CanActivate function here, and then call the switch to HTTP function, and then call the get request function. Okay, so in this way we can access to the request object, which is actually a express request object. And then we need to extract the token from the header of the request. So I'm going to create a separate function for that purpose. So here I'm going to create a private function, extract token from header, and take the request, which is type of request that comes from the Express library. So as you know, Nest.js by default uses the Express framework under the hood. So the request object is a request that comes from the Express library. Okay, and then inside this function, we're going to check the header of the request object. So here I'm going to define a tuple here, which have a type and also a token, and then set it to request.headers.authorization, and then call the split function. So I'm going to split it based on the empty space. So I'm going to pass the empty space here. So the access token must be inside a authorization header in the request. And then if it's not there, we just return a empty array here. Okay, and then we can check the type of the token. So here we're going to return if type of the token is a bearer, we can return the token, and else we just return undefined. So this function first check if a authorization header is inside the header of the request, and if it's there, it will split it to the type and token, and then we check if the type of the token is bearer, it just return the access token, and else it returns undefined. Okay, let me show you an example here. When we are going to include the access token inside the authorization header of our HTTP request, we put something like this in the authorization header. First, we put a bearer string and then a white space, and then we put our actual access token that we've got from the login API. So the authorization header is something like this. In the extract token from header function, first we split this authorization header based on the white space here. So this authorization header will be broken down to the type and the token. And then inside the extract token from header function, first we check if the type is bearer, we return this token as the return value of the function. Otherwise, we just return undefined. So let's get back to our JWT guard class. So now we can call the extract from header in the can activate function. So I'm going to say const token and set it to this dot extract token from header. So we have a typo here, so let's fix it. Okay, and now we can check if the token is undefined. We can throw an unauthorized exception. So here I'm going to say if not token, then just throw an new unauthorized exception. And if there is a bearer token, we should verify that token if it's valid or not. So I'm going to say const payload, and we should use the JWT service here. So here in the constructor of this JWT guard service, I'm going to inject the JWT service here. So here I'm going to say private JWT service and set its type to JWT service class. And as you can see, the JWT service comes from the Nest.js/JWT module. Okay, and now we can use it. So here I'm going to say await this the JWT service that verify async, and then we can pass the token and also pass the option object. We should pass the same secret key that we have used in order to create that JWT access token in the login function. So I'm going to say secret and set it to process the env the JWT secret key. Okay, if the token is valid, the verify async function will extract the payload from the token and returns it. But if the token is not valid, it will throw an error. So we can wrap it inside a try catch block here. Okay, and then we put our catch block, and then after calling the verify function from the JWT service, we can put the payload inside the request object. So later we can extract the payload from the request object. So I'm going to say request and set the user key here and set it to payload. Okay, and if the verify async function throw an error here, we catch it here and we just throw an unauthorized exception here. And then as a last step in this can activate function, we just return true. So if we don't throw an unauthorized exception here and also here, we reach to the return true statement and return true. So we are allowing the request to reach our protected API. So let's remove this boolean here to fix this error and also this observable error, and that will fix the first error here. And here we forgot to pass body block of our constructor. So let's put it here and we're good to go. And also as a last step, we need to decorate this JWT guard class with the injectable decorator, so later we can use this in our controllers. Okay, so let's save this and let's go to our user controller here, and here we can use a decorator called use guards, which comes from the Nest.js, and then pass our guards here, which is our JWT guard that we've just created. So now let's go back to Insomnia, and here let's check if the authorization here, so let's remove it. Okay, and let's send the request to our user API, and I think our server is not running, so we have an error here, and that's because we should register the JWT service inside our user module. So I'm gonna put it here and let's save this, and the error is gone. Let's get back to Insomnia and send the request, and you can see this time we got an unauthorized error, and that's because we didn't provide the access token in the header of our request. So let's get back to our login API and let's provide the correct password and username here and send the request. You can see we have an access token here. Let's grab the access token. Okay, and let's get back to our user profile, and inside the header we need to have an authorization header. okay, and then we need to add the bearer token, a space, and then our access token. So as you can see, our access token starts with the bearer string and then a white space and then our actual access token. So now if I send the request, and again we've gotten an unauthorized error here, and let's check here, and that's because we misspelled the bearer here. So let's fix this, okay, and let's send the request, and as you can see, this time the JWT guard allows us to reach the protected API. So if I tamper with the access token and then send the request, you can see that again we've gotten an unauthorized error message here. So yeah, in this way we can protect our APIs inside the Nest.js application. Okay, now we are moving to the next section, which is about creating a refresh token API. So let's go back to our application, and inside the auth service here you can see that we set the expires time of the JWT access token to 1 hour. So let's change it to just 20 seconds. Okay, and now let's get back to Insomnia and send a login request to get a new access token. Let's copy that and let's get back to our user profile API and let's paste it here. For the first time, you can see it allows us to reach the protected API. But after 20 seconds, if I click on the send again, you can see with the same access token, we got an 4.1 unauthorized error message here again. And that's because our access token will be valid only for 20 seconds here. So I put the 20 second here for the testing purposes, but in the real world application, usually we set the expiry time of the JWT access token to about 5 hours, but here for testing purposes, I just set it to 20 seconds, which is not realistic. Anyway, we need to create a refresh token API. So if our access token is not valid anymore, we can send a request to the refresh token API and provide the refresh token in our header of the request, which is usually valid for 1 week. Then we can get a new access token. So let's create this API in the auth module. So I go to the auth controller, and here we're going to define our refresh API. It should be a post endpoint, and let's call it refresh. And then I'm going to create the refresh token function here. Okay, before defining the refresh token function in the auth service, let's create another guard for our refresh token API. So I go to the guards directory inside the auth module, and here let's create a file called refresh.guard.ts, and let's go to the JWT guard and copy everything from this file and just paste it here. So it is almost the same with the JWT guard. All we need to do is to rename the class to the refresh JWT guard, and here let's change the extract token from header. Here we expect the refresh token to be inside the authorization header, but the type of header, instead of being a bearer, we expect it to be a refresh. Okay, and here when verifying the refresh token, we need to pass the JWT refresh token key, because when we are creating the refresh token inside the login API here, as you can see, we use the JWT refresh token key as the secret key. So when we are going to verify that token, we need to provide the same secret key. So let's get back to our refresh guard here, and I think we are done here. So it's almost exactly the same as the JWT guard. We are passing the JWT refresh token key as the key for verifying the token here, and here we expect that the type of the token should be refresh inside the authorization header of the request. And here, as you can see, just like the JWT guard, we extract the payload from the token and then put it inside a user key in the request. So let's get back to our auth controller and decorate this refresh token API with the use guard, and then pass the refresh JWT token guard. Okay, so now we are going to access to the request object. So here we put the request decorator inside the refresh token function, and then we're going to call it rec. So the rec is actually the request object. So here incoming request first goes through the refresh JWT guard, and if it has a valid refresh token inside its header, it will pass from the refresh JWT guard. And let's go back to the JWT guard, and here, as you can see, the payload object will be embedded inside the request object with the user key. So here we can access to the rec.user. So now we are going to create a refresh token function in the auth service, and then we can call it here. So I go to the auth service, And here we're going to create a refresh token function. So I'm going to say async refresh token. It is going to expect a user object, which actually is the payload object that is embedded inside the request in the refresh JWT guard. So the type of this should be any, because it's not actually a user type. It's just a payload that is extracted from the refresh JWT. Okay, so now just like the login function, we can create a payload here from the user object. So here the user object doesn't have an email. I just mentioned that it's not actual user object, it's a payload. So here, as you can see, when we are creating the payload in the login API, we create a username property inside the payload. So now it has just a username and also a SOP object. So here we set the username to the user.username, and we are passing the SOP to the just user.SOP. And that's because here we have a SOP object inside our payload. So again, this user object is actually this payload object that we have used to create the JWT access token and also refresh token. And let's copy the backend token object here, and we can return it as the return value of the refresh token function. So I'm going to say return and put this object here. So the refresh token just return object that contains the access token and refresh token inside it. It doesn't have the user object inside it. It will actually renew the access token and also the refresh token. So now let's get back to Insomnia here. In the login API, if we grab the refresh token here and go to the refresh token API, as you can see, it will send a post request to the /auth/refresh. And here inside the authorization header, we have the refresh string. So let's change the first letter to a capital letter, because here in the refresh guard here, we expect it to be with a capital R letter. So let's get back to Insomnia and let's paste the refresh token that we've just got from the login API. And if I send the request, it will return nothing, and that's because inside the auth controller we didn't call the auth service.refresh token. So we just return await this .auth service.refresh token and pass the rec object .user. Okay, so let's save this and get back to Insomnia. And this time if I send the request, you can see we got an object which has a new access token inside it as well as a new refresh token. So yeah, in this way we can easily create a new access token and also a new refresh token with the refresh API in the auth module. So let's quickly recap what we have done here. First, we create a refresh JWT guard, and inside this guard we check that if the refresh token is inside the authorization header, and if it's there, we verify that refresh token with the same key that we have created the refresh token in the login API. And then if the token is valid, we just extract the payload from the refresh token and put it in the user key of the request object. Otherwise, we just return an unauthorized exception. So if I tamper with the refresh token here and send the request, the refresh token is not valid and we've got a unauthorized error message here. So in this way, we can create a refresh token API. So now I think we're done with the Nest.js project and we are ready to move to the next section of this tutorial, which is about the creating our front-end application, in which we are going to create our front-end client with a Next.js project and also handle the authentication with the NextAuth package. So let's get right into it. But before moving forward, if you're still watching this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I have a variety of tutorials about Next.js, Nest.js, and TypeScript that I'm sure that they will be useful for you. So now let's create our Next.js application. Okay, in this section of this tutorial, we are going to create this application with Next.js version 13, and we are going to integrate it with the NextAuth, and also we are going to consume our backend APIs that we have created earlier in this video. So as you can see, it has a homepage link, a dashboard link, and also a sign in and a sign up button here. And if I click on the sign in here, you can see we are headed to the sign in page that is created by the NextAuth. And if I click on the sign in, you can see now the name of the user is shown in the app bar and a sign up button is there instead of the sign in and sign up button there. So if I click on the sign out, you can see we are headed to the home page of our application. And if I click on the sign up, here we can register a new user in our backend server. So now let's get back to our home page. And if I click on the dashboard page, you can see we are headed to the login page automatically. directory, and that's because we are protecting the dashboard page from the unauthenticated user with the NextAuth middleware. So if I click on the sign in and sign in here, now we can access to the dashboard page, which is a protected page. And also we have a user profile here in the dashboard page. And if I click on that, we are headed to the dynamic route of the user / ID of the user. And here we are getting the data from the user API in the backend server, which is protected by the JWT guard. So we are using our access token that we've got from our backend server to be able to access to the protected API in our backend server. So in this section, you are going to learn how to integrate the NextAuth with your Next.js application, how to implement the credentials provider, create a sign-in page, protect your pages with the middleware, and also you are going to learn a robust way of refreshing your access token with the NextAuth. This solution works on the client components as well as the server components. So without further ado, let's get to this section of our tutorial. Okay, I open up our Next.js project, and the first thing we should do here is to install the NextAuth. So I'm going to open up my terminal and say npm I NextAuth. Okay, and then we should create our NextAuth route handler. So here inside the app directory, I'm going to create an API directory, and then inside it, I'm going to create the auth directory, and then inside it, we can define our catch-all route for the NextAuth. So inside square brackets, I'm going to put 3 dots here, and then NextAuth. And then inside this directory, I'm going to create the route.ts file, which is our route handler. So every request to this /API/auth and then /whatever, just like this, will be handled by this file. So let's open it, and inside it, the first thing we should do here is to define the auth options. And also we should export it from this file. So I'm going to say export const auth options and then set its type to the NextAuth option. And as you can see, the NextAuth options comes from the NextAuth. And then we set it to an object here. And then inside it, the first thing we should define is the providers list. So as you know, NextAuth provides a variety of providers like Google provider, GitHub provider, and so on. But the most basic one is the credentials provider, which is used for authenticating the users with a username and password. So our users must have a username and password in order to be able to sign in into our application. So here I'm going to specify the providers list and set it to a list here, and inside it I'm going to put the credentials provider. So first we need to import it from the NextAuth/providers/credentials and then put it here, credentials provider. And then inside it we should pass a option object, and then the first thing we should define is the name for our provider, which I'm going to set it to credential. And then we should define a credentials object, which actually describes our sign-in page, which will be created automatically by the NextAuth. So here I'm going to put the credentials object, which has a username object that describes the username input in our sign-in page. It has a label, its type is text, and it has a placeholder. And also we have the password input here, the label and type of the password inside it. So this credentials object is for creating the sign-in page. So NextAuth will create a sign-in page for us based on the credentials object here. Although we can create our custom login page, and I have a tutorial for that, and its link is now on the screen. So let's get back to our credentials provider here, and the most important section of the credentials provider is the authorize function. It's an async function that takes the credentials object and a request object. And here, don't confuse the credentials object in the parameter of the authorize function with this credentials object. When a user in the sign-in page click on the sign-in button, the username and password of the user will be packed inside the credentials object and will be passed to the authorize function. And then inside this function, we need to decide whether the user can be authenticated or not. Inside this authorize function, actually, we check the username and password of the user. And if they are correct, we should return a user object, which means that the user is authenticated. And if they are not correct, we have two options. Either we can return a null value, which result in sending a error message to the sign-in page of the user, which says that your username and password is not correct. And the second option is to throw an error here, which redirect the user to the error page of the next auth. So let's define the body of the authorized function here. The first thing we should check here is to check the username and password if they have a undefined value. So if that's the case and one of them has undefined value, we just return null to the next auth. Otherwise, we grab the username and password from the credentials object, and since we have an external API for our login, we should send a post request to that login API in our Nest.js server. So the Nest.js login API checks the username and password for us, as we saw in the Nest.js section. So here we need to send post request to our backend URL /auth/login. And let's import the backend URL from the leap.const file, where I have defined it and set it to the HTTP localhost port 8000, which is the address of our Nest.js server. So let's get back to our credentials provider here, and then we should check if the status code of our request is 401, which means that the user is not authenticated. We first log the status text of the request, and then we just return null to next auth, which means that the user is not authenticated. So remember that in our login API in the Nest.js server, if the username and password was not correct, we just throw an unauthorized exception, which actually sends back a 401 error message to the client. So otherwise, we can grab the user object from our response object, and then we can return the user object to the next auth. That's it for the authorized function. Okay, and then we need to define our actual route handler. So here I'm going to say const handler and set it to next auth function, which comes from the next auth, and pass the auth option that we have defined here. So I'm going to put it inside the next auth function. And then we can export this handler as the get function and also as the post function. And one question you might ask is that why we didn't pass the auth options directly to the next auth, and why we should export it from this file. You will find this answer later in this video, but I'm going to quickly tell you the answer. If we want to access to the next auth session in the server components, we can use the get server session function from the next auth, and this function will require the auth options as its argument. So we need to export it from this file, and later we can use it in the get server session function. But one of the common mistakes here is to export this handler instead of the auth option object, and then when we try to use this handler as the parameter of the get server session, we will not get the session from the get server session function of the next auth. So again, don't export the handler and use it as the auth options. Define the auth options as a separate object and then export it from this file, and then use it in the next auth function. So yeah, that's it for now for the route handler. We will get back to this file later in this video to add some more configurations, but for now we are done here. Okay, so now in our Next.js project, when we want to know if the user is authenticated or not, we can get the next auth session. And in order to have access to the next auth session, we have two options. In the client components, we can use the use session hook, which actually saves the next auth session inside a React context API. But in the server components, we can use the get server session function from next auth that will return the next auth session in our server components and also in the API routes. So now let's configure the use session hook. As I said, it's actually a React context API. So we need to wrap our whole application in a session provider, which is actually a React context provider. So here inside the components directory, I'm going to define a providers component. Okay, and then inside it, we just create a component that takes the children as a props and then wrap them inside a session provider, which as I said is actually a React context API provider. So first let's define an interface for the props of the providers component. It has a children inside it. Okay, and then we need to import the session provider from the next auth/React. Okay, Okay, and then we go to the root layout of our application and wrap all the pages inside our application with the providers component that we have just created. Okay, and now every client component in our application can have access to the use session hook of the next auth. Okay, and one thing we forgot here is to set the providers component to the use client. Okay, and let's get back to our root layout. So the providers component is a client component, and here you might ask, wrapping the children of the root layout inside a client component, the providers component, does it make all pages to client components? And the answer is no. We can have a server component wrapped inside a client component, and that doesn't turn it to a client component. Okay, so now let's move to the next section, which is creating our sign-in button. So here I'm going to go to the components directory and create a sign-in button here. Okay, so let's create a component here. So here, if the user is already authenticated, we should render the name of the user and also a sign out link. And if the user is not authenticated, we just need to render the sign in and also sign up buttons. So here, in order to see if the user is authenticated or not, we can use the use session hook from the next auth. So I'm going to use the use session hook, and let's import it from the next auth/react, and then we can grab the data object here and just rename it to the session. And now we can check if the session is existed and also it has a user object inside it. We can say that the user is authenticated. So we're going to render the name of the user and also a sign out link. So as you can see, we render the name of the user inside a p tag session.user.name, and also we have a link here which calls the /API/auth/signout. So as you remember, every request to the /API/auth and then /whatever will be handled by the route handler of the next auth that we've just defined here. Okay, and then we need to just import the link from the next link. It's a link from the Next.js, and if this condition is not true, which means that the user is not authenticated yet, we need to render a sign-in link and also a sign-up link. So here, instead of this return here, we return a link that goes to the /API/auth/sign-in, and also we have another link for signing up or registering a new user, which goes to the /signup. So as you can see, this route here will be handled by the next auth automatically, but this sign up route here will not handle by the next auth because it doesn't start with the /API/auth. So we need to create our own sign up page, and we will create it in the next section of this video. So here, just in case, know that instead of having a link here, we can have a button here, and inside the onClick event of that button, we can call the sign in function, which comes from the next auth, and that will automatically send us to the sign in page of the next auth. And also here, instead of this link, we can call the sign out function from the next auth, which actually sign out the user from our application. So you can choose between these two options here. Okay, so this is our sign in button component, and then we need to go to the app bar component, and as you can see, it's a app bar that has two links, the home page and also the dashboard page, which we haven't created yet. And then we need to put our sign in button here. So I just put it here and import it from the sign in button.tsx file. Okay, so now let's run our application. Okay, so we have an error here, and that's because the use session hook can't be used inside the server component. So let's get back to our sign in button here and mark it with the use client directive here. So let's save this and let's get back to our browser, and as you can see, we have the app bar here which has the sign in button inside it. So if I click on the sign in button here, you can see it will send us to the sign in page that is created automatically by the next auth. Okay, so if I click on the sign in here, it will pack the username and password of the user into a credentials object and call the authorize function. And let's get back to our next auth route handler, and you can see here inside the authorize function, we send a request to our Nest.js server to the /auth/login API, and that will check the username and password, and if they're not correct, it sends us an 401 error message. Otherwise, it returns an object that has the user object inside it as well as the access tokens. So let's get back to our sign in page, and click on the sign in here. And as you can see, we have authenticated because the sign out button is here, but here we don't have the name of the user. And that's because the type of the return object from our login API in the Nest.js server is not compatible with the type of the user object inside NextAuth in the Next.js project. So let's get back to the sign in button, and here let's check the user object here. You can see it has an email, image, and name. But if I get back to the Insomnia here, you can see that the return object from the login API of our Nest.js application, our backend server, is an object that has the user inside it, but that user has the ID, email, name, and then a backend tokens object that has the access token and also the refresh token inside it. So we should change the type of the user object inside the NextAuth session to be compatible with this whole object. So in order to do that, I go back to our Next.js application, and inside the lib directory, I'm going to create a type file. I'm going to name it next-auth.d.ts. Okay, and then the first thing we should do here is to import NextAuth from the NextAuth package. Okay, and then we need to declare a module NextAuth, and then inside we can change the type of the session object. So I'm going to define an interface here and name it session. Just pay attention to the spelling here, and then here we can define the shape of our session object. It has a user inside it, which is going to have a ID, email, and name. So let's put it inside the user interface here, and then it has the backend tokens object. So here I'm going to put another object here, backend tokens object, which has the access token and also the refresh token inside it. Okay, so let's save this, and if I go back to our sign in button here, and now if I click on the session, you can see it has now a user object as well as a backend tokens object inside it. And then we can use the user object, and now we can access to the name of the user. Okay, so let's save this and get back to our browser, and let's sign out now. Okay, and let's sign in again. Okay, and as you can see, we still doesn't have access to the name of the user. So let's get back to our sign in button here, and here let's just log the session object to see what's going on there. So let's open up our console here and let's sign out. Okay, and sign in again, and we have the session object here, and let's expand it, and as you can see, it doesn't have the backend token inside it, and the user object doesn't have the ID, name, and also email inside it. In order to fix this problem, we need to use NextAuth callbacks. So I go back to the route handler of the NextAuth, and after the providers list, I'm going to define the callbacks object. So what is the callbacks? They are asynchronous functions that we can use to control what happens when an action is performed. So we can define 4 callbacks here: a JWT, redirect, session, and sign in. We're going to use JWT and session here. So what are the JWT and session callbacks? So let me show you a diagram here. When a user signs into our application, a JWT callback will be called, and it receives the token and a user inside it. We're going to check the token and user in a second. And then the JWT callback returns the token object, and the token object will be received by the session callback. And also when we are checking the session of the NextAuth, the JWT callback also will be called, but this time the user object is undefined. And then it returns the token, and the token will be received by the session callback. So in the JWT callback, the user object is only available when the user signs into our application. So now let's get back to our NextAuth route handler and define the JWT callback. I'm going to say async JWT, and then it receives the token and also the user, and then it just need to return the token from it. Okay, and now let's log the token and user object here to see what's going on. So let's log them here. Okay, and now let's get back to our browser and let's sign out. Okay, and let's sign in again. Let's click on the sign in with the credentials here. Okay, and now let's check the VS Code terminal here. And as you can see, the first time we have the user object here when the user is signing. And the second time when we get the session from the use session hook inside the sign button, here we have the token, but the user is undefined. But the first time you can see that the user object is actually the object that the backend login API will return as the response. So now all we have to do here inside the JWT callback, we need to check if the user is available. We embed the user object into the token object. So the user data can be received by the session callback. So here I'm going to check if the user is available. We're going to return an object here that contains the token data. So I'm going to spread the token here. And also we need to spread the user data here. Otherwise, if the user is not available, we just return the token. And now we can define the session callback here and receive the token from the JWT callback. So I'm going to say async session callback here, and it received the token and also the session object here. Every time the session will be get by the use session hook or get server session function, the session callback will be called. So here we need to say that session.user and set it to token.user. So as you can see, we have spread the user object here, which is not this user object. It is the whole object that contains the user object and also the backend tokens. So don't confuse them with this user object here. You can name it whatever you want, and I should have done it in order to avoid confusion. But keep in mind that the user object that is received by the JWT callback is the whole object that returns by the login API. Okay, so let's get back to our session callbacks here, and we can set the session.user to the token.user. As you can see, the token doesn't have a user object inside it. So if I hit the control space here, you can see that the token doesn't have a user object. So what we need to do here is to change the type of the token. The type of the token itself is the JWT that comes from the next auth. So we need to change the shape of the JWT type. In order to do that, I go to the nextauth.d.ts file, and here we need to import the JWT type from the nextauth/JWT, and then we're going to declare the module nextauth/JWT, and then we need to define a JWT interface. So here I'm going to say interface JWT, and then we just need to copy the user type here and also the backend tokens type here and put it inside the JWT interface. So let's save this, and as you can see, the shape of the JWT is exactly as the same of the session interface. So let's get back to our route handler of the next auth, and now if I hit the control space here, you can see now we can have access to the backend tokens and also the user object here. So we set the session.user to the token.user, and then in order to save the backend tokens inside the session object, we need to say that session.backend tokens and set it to token.backend token. And then we just need to return the session from the session callback. Okay, so let's save this, and if I sign out here and again sign in here, and let's check the session object here in the console, and you can see now session have the backend access token and also the user inside it, and we already have the name of the user in the sign in button. So in this way we can change the type of the session object and make it compatible with the type of the object that our backend login API is returning. Okay, in this section we're going to create our sign up page for registering a new user. So if I click on the sign up here, you can see we are headed to a 404 error page because we didn't define the page for the sign up route here. So now let's create this page in our Next.js application. So I go back to our Next.js project, and inside the app directory, I'm going to create a route for sign up, and inside it we're going to create our page.tsx file. Okay, and then we're going to create a component here, and let's name it sign up page. Okay, and to speed up the process, let me paste the JSX here for the sign up page. So as you can see, it has 3 input boxes here. The input box is just an input element with a label text attached to it. So you can find it inside the components directory of this project. So let's import it from the components directory. Okay, and then we need to define a state for our form here. So we're going to define a useref here, which its type is form input. So now let's paste the form inputs here. It's a type that has a name, email, and password inside it. So the type of this useref here is an object that has a name, email, and password inside it. And here, as you can see, we bind the name to the first input box, the email to the second, and also the password to the third input box. So we use a useref here, and that's because we don't want to re-render the page every time user enter a character in each of our input boxes. And after the input boxes here, as you can see, we have a button here. So let's import the button from the components directory. And we have also a link here that is for canceling the form. It redirects the user to the home page. And the on-click event of the button, we call the register function. So let's define the register function here. You can also use the server actions here, but for the simplicity, we just go ahead with a normal function here. And here, let's import the backend URL from the constants file. Okay, so the register function will send a post request to the backend URL /auth/register API, and then put the name, email, and password of this form to the body of the post request. And then we check if the response is not okay. We just show the error message to the user and then return the function. And if there is no error here, we can grab the response object here, which is actually the user object that has been inserted to our database, and we can just show a user registered message to the user. So let's save this, and we need to mark it with the use client here. So let's go back to our browser and click on the sign up. As you can see, we have the sign up form here, and let's put my name here. And let's go ahead with a duplicated user because this email is already saved in our database. So let's click on the submit, and you can see we have a conflict error here. And let's turn it to Sakura33, for example, and click on the submit here. And as you can see, we have the user registered message here. So now we can grab this email and click on the sign in here. Let's put the Sakura33 here, and our password is also 123, and click on the sign in here. And you can see now we are signing with the new user in our application. Okay, and in the next section, we are going to quickly create the dashboard page here, and we are going to protect it from the unauthenticated user with the NextAuth middleware. So now let's quickly create our dashboard page. I go back to our project here, and let's create the dashboard route here inside our app directory. And then inside it, we're going to create our page.tsx. Okay, and let's create a functional component here, and let's rename it to dashboard page. Okay, and let's create a layout for our dashboard route. Okay, and let's paste the code for the dashboard page here. As you can see, we're going to have a sidebar here, and inside it, we have a link here, and that link will be send us to a dynamic route /dashboard/user, and then ID of the user, which will retrieve the user profile from our backend API and then show them to the user. And then we are going to render the children of the layout in a div here. So this will be our sidebar. So this is a server component, and in order to have access to this session of the NextAuth, we can't use session hook because, as I said, it's a server component. So instead, we are going to use the get server session. So I'm going to say const session and set it to await. As you can see, it's a async component. So we can use the await keyword here, and then we can use the get server session that comes from the NextAuth. So as you can see, it is coming from the NextAuth. Okay, and then we just need to pass the auth option that we have exported from the NextAuth route handler, this auth options object. So I go back to our dashboard layout and just pass the auth options. Okay, as you can see, it is imported from the NextAuth route handler. And as I said in the beginning of this section, one of the mistakes that we might have here is to export the handler that we've got from the NextAuth function. And then we try to use the handler as the auth options in the get server session, and it won't work. It will return a session that has an undefined value. So keep in mind that from the route handler of the NextAuth, first create a separate auth options and put your configurations here, and then export it from this file. So don't forget to export the auth options from the NextAuth route handler. Okay, and let's save this, and let's get back to our browser, and let's go to the dashboard page here. Okay, and as you can see, we have the layout here, and this is our page, and this is the link inside the layout file. And if I click on that, it redirects us to the /user/3, which is the ID of the current user that is coming from the session of the NextAuth. And here, as you can see, we are getting that with the get server session. So now let's create our dynamic route for the user here. Inside the dashboard, I'm going to create a user route and then an ID dynamic route and then page.tsx. Okay, again, to speed up the process, I just paste the code for this user page. And as you can see here, we have defined a type for the props for this page. And then inside it, we have the params object, which is an ID here. And with that, we can access to the ID params here. And we have the page here, which is an async server components. And inside it, it sends a GET request to the backend URL and then /user and then /ID of the user that we've got from the params.id. Okay, and then we've got the user from the response of this GET request, and then we just render the name of the user here and also the email of the user. But if I go back to our Nest.js application, you can see inside the user controller in the /user/ID API, we protect it with the JWT guard. It means that we should have an authorization header inside the header of our request to this API. So we didn't provide the authorization header inside it. So let's run this request and see what we get back as the response of this GET request. Okay, so I go back to our browser and click on the user profile, which will direct us to the dashboard /user/1, which is the ID of the current user. But we don't have any data here. So let's go back to our Next.js project and open up our terminal and see what we have here. So here, as you can see, we have logged the response, but here, as you can see, the status code is 401 and the status text is unauthorized. And that's because we didn't include the authorization header inside the headers of this GET request. So now let's include the authorization here. I'm going to say authorization. Okay, and then we put the bearer text here, and then we need to put our access token. So in order to have access to the access token of the current user, we need to have access to the session of the next auth. So here I'm going to say const session and set it to await get server session and then pass the auth options. Okay, and now we can put the access token here in the authorization header. So I'm going to use the session.backend tokens.access token. Okay, so let's save this and get back to our browser and let's refresh the page. And as you can see, again, we don't have any data here. And let's get back to our Next.js project. And as you can see here, again, we have a 401 unauthorized message. And I'm going to tell you why it is happening here. I go back to our Nest.js application, and inside the auth service here, you can see that we have set the expiry time of the access token to just 20 seconds. So now if I sign out and sign in to get a new access token, and then if I click on the dashboard and user profile, you can see we have our data here. But after 20 seconds, the access token of the user is expired. And if I refresh the page, you can see again, we don't have any data because the access token is expired now. So later in this video, we are going to implement a refresh token functionality in order to automatically refresh the token when the access token is expired. And we are going to use a solution that works in the server component as well as the client components. But before doing that, I'm going to protect the dashboard page and all of its children pages from the unauthenticated user. So if I click on the sign out here, and if I click on the dashboard, you can see I can have access to the dashboard page even though I'm not signing in our application. So we can protect our pages in two ways with the next auth. We can get the session from the get server session in our pages and then check if the session is not undefined. It means that the user is authenticated and we can allow user to access to the page. And here we can get the session from the get server session, and if the session is undefined, it means that the user is not authenticated and we can redirect it to the login page manually. But we can do this automatically with the next auth middleware. So here, in order to do that, I'm going to create a middleware.ts file inside the src directory. And here we can just export default from next auth middleware. And then we can export a config object here that has a matcher list inside it. And inside the matcher, we can define our protected pages. So we are going to protect the dashboard page and all its children pages. So let's save this. And now if I go back to our application and if I refresh the page, you can see the next auth automatically redirect us to the login page. So let's get back to the home page and again click on the dashboard page. But again, we we are headed to the login page because we're not signed in. So if I sign in here, again, I click on the dashboard page, we can have access to the dashboard page because we have signed in into our application. And that's it. We can easily protect our pages with the NextAuth middleware. Okay, in this section, we are going to implement the refresh token functionality for our Next.js application. So as you can see, when our access token is expired, we can refresh the access token automatically in Next.js. So let's get right into it. So as a first step, we need to go back to our Nest.js application, our backend server. And here in the auth service, in the login function, we return the backend tokens, which contains the access token and also the refresh token. We need to export another property inside the backend tokens, which is expiry time. So first of all, we need to define a constant here, const expire time, and we're going to set it to 20 seconds. So it is going to be 20 times 1000 milliseconds is going to be 20 seconds. And here in the login function, after the refresh token, we can have a expires in property that takes the current time of the server and then add the 20 seconds to the current time of the server. So the expires time here is the 20 seconds after the current time of our server. So as I said, the 20 seconds is not a realistic time for expiry time of the access token. Usually we set it to more than 5 hours or a day for the access token and 7 days for the refresh token. But here, for the testing purposes, we can't wait 5 hours for our token to be expired. So I set it to 20 seconds here. And we also need to add the expires in property in the returning object of the refresh token function as well. So let's copy that, and here in the refresh token function, inside the return object, we include the expires in property. Okay, so now our backend tokens object has the expires in property inside it. So let's get back to our Next.js application. And let's go to our nextauth.t.ts file, and here we can include the expires time in the backend tokens interface here. And also we're going to include it in the JWT interface here. Okay, so let's save this, and I go to the route handler of our NextAuth, and here in the JWT callback, we can refresh our token. As I said earlier, the JWT function will be called every time the session is checked. So here, instead of returning the token, we can check if the current time of the Next.js server is less than the backend tokens.expires in, which we've got from the backend APIs, which is return the token. This condition here means that the access token is not expired. The time of our system is less than the expiry time of the access token. So just return the token. But if this condition is not true, it means that the time of our system is now greater than the expiry time of the access token. So it means that the access token is now expired. So now here we can refresh the token. Now we can define a refresh token functions and call it here to refresh the token and then return the token from the JWT callback with the refreshed tokens. So now we are going to define our refresh token function. Here outside the auth options, I'm going to define async function refresh token, which take a token, which its type is the JWT, and just return a promise that resolves to a JWT type. So again, this token inside the JWT callback is type of JWT. Okay, so here we can get the token and then renew its backend access tokens and then return it with the refresh token. So let's define the body of this function. We just need to send a post request to our backend URL and then /auth/refresh, which is for refreshing the token. And then inside the authorization header of this post request, we need to put the refresh string and then the token that backend tokens that refresh token. So if I go back to our Nest.js application, in the auth controller, you can see we have a refresh token API and we protect it with the refresh token JWT guard that expect the request to have a refresh token inside its authorization header. So we put the old token that backend tokens that refresh token. The expiry time of the refresh token is 7 days. So it's not expired yet. Now let's import the JWT type from the NextAuth/JWT to get rid of that error. and we have a typo here. Let's change it to a lowercase and we're good to go. And then we need to get the response of this post request, and now we can return a new token with the refreshed access token. And now we just return an object here, spread the token, and we set the backend tokens to the response of this backend refresh API. So let's save this and let's get back to our JWT callback. And here we can say if this condition is not true, we just return await and then call the refresh token function that we've just created and pass the token inside it. So in this way, we can easily refresh the token every time the token is expired. So now let's log the refreshed string here. So every time this refresh token function is triggered, we can see it inside the console of this project. So let's open up the terminal and let's get back to our project and let's sign out. Okay, let's sign in again. We can have access to the data of our backend API. So let's wait for 20 seconds. And after 20 seconds here, if I refresh the page, you can see again, we don't have the data here. Let's check it here. We call the refresh function, but the status code is 401. So let's go back to our Nest.js project, go to the refresh JWT guard, and here check the extract token from the header. And yeah, we expecting the type of the refresh token to start with the R letter in the uppercase. So let's get back to our Nest.js application, and here let's go to the next auth route handler and in the refresh token function, and let's change the first letter of the refresh to the uppercase. So let's save this and let's refresh the page. Okay, and now let's sign out here. Again, sign in and then go to the user profile. Now I pause the video for 20 seconds. Okay, I have waited for 20 seconds, and if I refresh the page, and now we can see we are getting our data from the backend API, and that's because here, as you can see, the refresh token function has been triggered, and in the backend side also you can see we have access to the refresh API. So this mechanism will automatically refresh our tokens if the access token is expired. So let me recap what we have done in this section. In the JWT callback, first we check if the time of our system is less than the expired time of the tokens, we just return the token. But if the time of our system is greater than the expiry time of the tokens, it means that the access token is already expired. So we call the refresh token function and pass the token inside it, and the refresh token function will send a post request to the backend server and then /auth/refresh and put the authorization here with the refresh string here and put the refresh token of the current user inside it, and that will give us a new access token. And then here we just replace the backend tokens with the response that we've got from our backend API, which contains the new access token, new refresh token, and also a new expiry time. So that's it for the refresh token, and in this video you have learned the basic of authentication in a full stack project, and that brings us to the end of this tutorial. So stay tuned for my next video and have a nice time. Bye bye.